The new generation era is often remembered as colorful, experimental, and misunderstood, but sometimes the criticism is earned. Few characters represent the creative identity crisis of 1995 WWF better than Xanta Klaus, an evil Santa Claus managed by the $1 Million Man, introduced at a pay-per-view called In Your House 5, Seasons Beatings. This wasn't a fever dream. This actually happened. By late 1995, the World Wrestling Federation was throwing ideas at the wall, hoping something would stick. The Monday Night War had begun, WCW was pulling ahead, and Vince McMahon's once unshakable creative instincts were starting to misfire. The company was caught between cartoonish excess and a looming need for something grittier. But it didn't quite realize that yet. Instead, it doubled down on gimmicks, seasonal tie-ins, and characters that felt ripped from a children's variety show rather than a wrestling promotion fighting for survival. That's the environment Xanta Klaus was born into. Xanta Klaus would barely make it past a single televised match. His presence would be fleeting, his impact minimal. But his existence, brief as it was, perfectly captures where the WWF was in 1995. Creative, desperate, unfocused, and somehow, it happened on the same night the company unknowingly welcomed its biggest future star through the door. In Your House 5, Seasons Beatings took place on December 17, 1995, and if there was ever a pay-per-view designed to encapsulate the new generation era's tonal confusion, this was it. The name alone feels like a parody, half holiday special, half wrestling event. And the presentation leaned fully into that identity. Christmas imagery was everywhere. The ring, the promos, the atmosphere all suggested that this was meant to be fun, lighthearted, and seasonal, which made what happened next all the more strange. Randomly, Savio Vega came out with Santa Claus and started giving out gifts to kids in the audience. The crowd reacted with confusion, amusement, and that uniquely mid-90s acceptance that this is just what wrestling is sometimes. While this was happening, Ted DiBiase entered the ring, cutting a promo built around his long-standing philosophy: everyone has a price. DiBiase had reinvented himself in this era as the mouthpiece for the $1 Million Corporation, a stable rooted in greed, power, and corruption. While Vega and Santa were trying to bring Christmas cheer, the $1 Million Man continued his promo, hammering home the idea that no one, no profession, no role, no moral ideal was immune to money. And then Santa turned around and attacked Savio Vega. The reveal was immediate and unsubtle. The message was clear. Even Santa Claus had a price. In one moment, the WWF had taken a universally recognized symbol of goodwill and turned it into a heel. Because in 1995, shock and novelty were often treated as interchangeable with storytelling. The very next night on Monday Night Raw, DiBiase attempted to provide context. According to him, that wasn't Santa Claus at all. That was Xanta Klaus from the South Pole, and he had arrived in the WWF with one goal: to help the $1 Million Corporation ruin Christmas. What makes this stretch of television particularly fascinating is what was happening behind the scenes. That same week, the WWF taped multiple episodes of Raw in advance. 3 shows were recorded during these sessions, locking in weeks of programming before the audience could react to any of it. This meant that creative decisions, good or bad, were effectively frozen in time. When one of the episodes of Raw taped that week finally aired on December 23rd, Xanta Klaus returned, now dressed in a red and black outfit that stripped away any remaining ambiguity. This was no longer Santa Claus playing a role. It was a wrestler playing a concept. He faced Scott Taylor in a brief squash match, dominating him and finishing with the camel clutch. Taylor, of course, would later re-emerge as Scotty 2 Hotty, another reminder of how many future names passed quietly through this era. But pretty much that was it. No sustained push, no meaningful storyline, no payoff. Xanta Klaus appeared, fulfilled his seasonal purpose, and vanished just as quickly as he arrived. Years later, the $1 Million Man himself would reflect on the gimmick on his podcast, admitting that it wasn't the greatest idea and clarifying that it was Vince McMahon's concept from the start. That revelation doesn't absolve anyone, but it does perfectly contextualize the moment. Xanta Klaus wasn't a rogue decision or a creative accident. He was a deliberate choice made by a company still clinging to a version of wrestling that was rapidly becoming obsolete. At those Raw tapings, the WWF tried to ruin Christmas for cheap heat. What it didn't realize was that the real transformation, the one that would change everything, had already walked through the door, unnoticed, while everyone was busy booing Santa Claus. At the same tapings that introduced Xanta Klaus to television, the company also debuted another wrestler to the $1 Million Corporation, who would ultimately become the most important figure of the Attitude Era, a wrestler named the Ringmaster, who would later become Stone Cold Steve Austin. Behind the red suit and holiday villainy was John Rickner, a working professional wrestler navigating the same mid-90s ecosystem that fed much of the WWF's talent pipeline. At the time, Rickner was primarily working for Smoky Mountain Wrestling, a promotion that, like several others, maintained a loose talent-sharing relationship with the WWF. This system allowed wrestlers to move between companies, fill short-term roles, and gain national exposure without a formal long-term commitment. The names that pass through this pipeline are striking in hindsight. Kane, Al Snow, D'Lo Brown, and Bob Holly all spent time moving through these developmental or semi-developmental channels before finding their footing in the WWF. John Rickner wasn't an outlier. He was part of the same process, waiting for the opportunity that might turn into something permanent. That opportunity came in December 1995, when Rickner received a call from the Federation. The pitch was simple, if not exactly reassuring. The gimmick could last 3 days, or it could last 3 months. There was no promise of longevity, no long-term creative plan, just a role that needed to be filled immediately. Even internally, the WWF seemed aware that Xanta Klaus wasn't designed to endure. Rickner later recalled after his squash match, talking with J.J. Dillon, informing him that the character was being phased out. However, the door wasn't completely closed. He was told he could continue working independent dates while the company figured out what to do next. But there was a catch. He would have to remain Xanta Klaus. For Rickner, this was a non-starter. Outside of a very narrow window in December, an evil Christmas character had no value on the independent circuit. The audience wasn't seasonal, the bookings weren't thematic, and the gimmick wasn't flexible enough to evolve. Wrestling as Santa Claus in January wasn't quirky, it was pointless. Rickner requested his release from the WWF, and the company granted it, and just like that, Xanta Klaus was officially dead. Rickner returned to the independent scene, grinding away, refining his presence, and waiting for the right reinvention. That reinvention came almost exactly 1 year later, in December of 1996, at ECW's Holiday Hell. This time, he wasn't dressed for novelty or spectacle. He debuted under a new name, a new attitude, and a new identity: Balls Mahoney. The character Balls Mahoney became synonymous with ECW's brand of blunt force wrestling. Armed with steel chairs, tables, and an unpolished brawling style, he embodied the promotion's blue-collar brutality. He wasn't positioned as a top champion or a main event savior, but he didn't need to be. In ECW, roles mattered more than rankings, and Balls Mahoney's role was clear. He was violence personified. His tag team with Axl Rotten became one of the defining partnerships of late-era ECW. Together they were chaotic, reckless, and wildly popular. Two men whose matches felt less like athletic contests and more like sanctioned riots. When ECW folded and WWE launched its ECW revival in 2006, Mahoney was brought back as part of the brand's nostalgic core. This new ECW, however, was a very different environment. Sanitized and corporate, it could never fully recreate the chaos that made the original ECW special. Still, Balls Mahoney remained a recognizable presence, a bridge between what ECW had been and what WWE wanted it to represent. His WWE run was short and in many ways bittersweet. It lacked the danger, the unpredictability, and the raw energy that defined his ECW peak. But it also served as a kind of acknowledgement. The same company that once introduced him as an evil Santa Claus was now presenting him, however imperfectly, as a respected cult figure from one of wrestling's most influential movements. Xanta Klaus lasted only a few appearances, but his shadow stretches far beyond his screen time. Not because the gimmick was good, but because of what it reveals about the moment that created it. The New Generation era wasn't creatively bankrupt, but it was lost. It was a company trying to survive by leaning on ideas that once worked, even as the audience and the industry was moving on. John Rickner didn't fail as Xanta Klaus. The gimmick failed him. When given a role that fit the era's obsession with novelty, he was disposable. When allowed to strip everything away in ECW, he became Balls Mahoney, a cult figure whose authenticity couldn't be packaged, explained, or scheduled around a holiday. His career didn't change because he suddenly got better. It changed because wrestling did. Xanta Klaus exists today as a punchline, a trivia answer, or a holiday meme dusted off every December. But he also serves as a time capsule, a reminder of a company caught between eras, unsure of what it wanted to be, and unaware that the future was already standing in the room. Sometimes wrestling history isn't shaped by the stars who succeed, but by the ideas that fail, quietly marking the end of one era and the beginning of another. And for a brief moment in 1995, the WWF tried to ruin Christmas, only to accidentally set the stage for everything that came after.